Ariana Grande's fans are expressing their anger after the Grammy Awards snubbed the musician with their 2025 nominations. The singer released her seventh album, Eternal Sunshine, in March after a 3-year hiatus. The long-awaited album featured hits like Yes, and We Can't Be Friends, Wait for Your Love. Despite the album breaking records and Grande being praised over her vulnerability, the Grammys didn't include the album or any of the songs in their main categories, such as Album of the Year, Record of the Year, or Song of the Year. The Eternal Sunshine album did earn a spot in the Best Pop Vocal Album category, while Yes, and snagged a nomination in the Best Dance Pop Recording category. Grande, 31, received one final nomination in the Best Pop Duo/Group Performance for her remix song, This Boy Is Mine with Brandy and Monica. Shortly after the nominations were released on Friday, Grande's fans took to social media to share their outrage for both Eternal Sunshine and We Can't Be Friends, Wait for Your Love, getting snubbed. Ariana Grande, one of the few artists to almost entirely write, produce, and sing for her life on a personal, astonishingly constructed concept album, was once again snubbed, one person wrote on X. Eternal Sunshine is one of the most critically acclaimed albums of the year and the only this year to have multiple #1 singles and still didn't get an Album of the Year nominations. The hashtag Grammys remain rigged, another user shared on X. Ariana Grande not getting nominated in the main categories is a joke. Eternal Sunshine and We Can't Be Friends were snubbed. #Grammys, someone wrote via X, we are already witnessing Ariana Grande being snubbed again. What do you mean We Can't Be Friends is not nominated for Best Pop Solo Performance and Video of the Year? Embarrassing as always, another fan shared via X. What do you mean Ariana Grande wasn't nominated for Album, Song and Record of the Year? Just one King nomination? Justice for her and Eternal Sunshine. No wonder she wants to focus on acting, she was robbed, one upset fan wrote on X. We Can't Be Friends by Ariana Grande was easily the best video of the year with absolutely no contenders even coming close. The Grammys will pay for snubbing this amazing song from the music video and song categories. Another user commented via X, Eternal Sunshine got snubbed in the AOTY category. Another year of Ariana not being given the respect she deserves in the music industry. She is really being sabotaged and blackballed. Somebody save my sis, another upset user chimed in on X. Reps for Grande and the Recording Academy didn't return page 6 request for comment. Grande has also not addressed the snub. The Wicked star has previously butted heads with the Grammys in the past.